Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sniper Elite V2 for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii U. This is a third-person stealth shooter by Rebellion that was released in April of 2012 for PC and later saw release across a variety of different systems, culminating with the Wii U release in May of 2013. And it's actually kind of interesting because this is a remake of the original Sniper Elite, but it's also a sequel to it, to some degree. It's kind of weird how that works out. So basically you're just retreading the ground that you did in the original game, only it's a lot more condensed and more modernized. So what does that actually mean for the game? Does that mean that it just kind of ends up being gimmicky and typical modern crap, or does it kind of transcend that? As far as the presentation goes, it's not even comparable to the original game because they were so far apart, so I'm not even going to bother trying that. But this looks alright. It certainly looks like a late last-gen console game, but that's to be expected. It was built mainly for those. And what they managed to eke out of that was pretty impressive. You have some pretty detailed environments, and the character modeling and animations are also rather well detailed. So they did put quite a bit of effort into it. I just wish they hadn't done the whole brown and gray and realistic crap, because that drives me crazy no matter what the game is, no matter how good the game looks. If it's brown and gray and realistic, then I just get turned off of the visuals almost immediately. Again, that's not to say the visuals are bad, it's just that the color scheme is awful. Now there is one thing they tried to do that was different, and that is the bullet cam, where if you get a particularly good sniper shot in, it will actually follow the bullet as it leaves the barrel of your rifle and strikes the opponent and goes through their body. It'll show the organs being blasted apart, the bones shattering, all that sort of thing, and then you'll see the bullet exit their body and they just fall over. It's all in slow motion. And while that is really cool the first few times you do it, it does get old after a while. But occasionally you'll have a shot that you just can't help but go, oh, because it's just fairly gruesome. So yes, it's gimmicky as all hell, but at the same time, it's pretty cool, and it does set this thing apart from pretty much every other game out there. So they did a pretty cool job with the presentation, trying to make it different, even though it's in some ways very, very much the same as every other game out on the market at the time. But then you come to the sound design, where they did a pretty good job overall. The voice acting is rather solid, and yes, the Germans do speak German, the Russians do speak Russian, so you do have some authenticity there. Their accents are a bit odd, they enunciate a bit too much, but at least they tried, and it doesn't come across as just sounding completely ridiculous. And when you do have the narrator's voice acting, where you're playing as that character, he has that typical gruff, grizzled veteran voice that you've just become used to over the years, and you just kind of get turned off immediately. But the sound effects are all very nice, particularly with the sound effects when they go into slow motion. When you're just running around on the ground and using the well rod or whatever other pistol you've got, or the submachine gun and stuff like that, they're not all that great, but the slow motion effects applied to the sniper rifle shots and the evisceration of your opponents is all very good. The music, unfortunately, is very typical World War II fare, and if you've seen any World War II movie released basically since Saving Private Ryan, or you've played any video game set in World War II since Saving Private Ryan, you've heard this soundtrack. And I am so incredibly sick of that crap. But at least it's appropriate, I guess, and at least it's not something that's actually terrible music. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are an American OSS officer and sniper who has been sent into Berlin in 1945 to prevent the Russians from getting a hold of Germany's V2 rocket program, basically. And so you're basically just sent to eliminate a bunch of Nazi scientists and a Nazi general. And that's kind of the extent of the plot. It does get a bit more complicated later on when they try to throw a bit of a twist in there. But even then, that is just incredibly weak, and it doesn't really go anywhere. You're basically just doing the exact same thing that you set out to do in the first place. It just adds a slight bit of, well, now there's more motivation to do this because they're horrible people. Except you already knew that because they're Nazis. So, what do you expect? At any rate, the story doesn't really hold your interest all that long. What really does hold your interest is the actual gameplay, which, like I said, is a third-person stealth shooter. It is a third-person shooter in the sense of you have 3 weapons that you can choose from. Those are your sniper rifle, your submachine gun, and your pistol. Now you can swap out the pistol and submachine gun basically whenever you want to, but the sniper rifle you're basically stuck with. And what ends up happening is that you sneak around the levels, you will apply booby traps to lure your opponents into and such like that, so that they'll just get annihilated very easily. You might get into a gunfight here and there, but by and large, if you're getting into a gunfight, you've probably done something wrong, or you know exactly what you're doing and you set up things beforehand to make your gunfight not be horrible. Now, even then, I found out that if you just use the sniper rifle, then you're probably not going to have all that much of a hard time, because even though the submachine gun and the pistols are not particularly powerful, the sniper rifle is basically a one-hit kill, or maybe 2 or 3 at most. And so what ends up happening is that you try to take your opponents out from really far away, exactly as a sniper should. But that tends to go south fairly often, because for some reason the enemy is just really good at seeing you. Even if you are really far away, behind cover, that sort of thing, they will spot you. Now, whether they spot you before you've gotten a shot off is entirely up to how good your timing is. And there is some degree of skill involved, because there is bullet drop, there is wind simulation, so they do actually have some pretty realistic bullet physics going on, where once that bullet leaves the barrel, it is not going to go in a straight line like you're used to in pretty much any FPS on the market, or third-person shooter for that matter. And so you have to plan out your shots, your escape route, how many booby traps you want to set up for if your opponents do discover where you are, that sort of thing. And it's a fairly interesting setup where your equipment is fairly limited. If you're going with the submachine gun or the pistol, you've basically got a handful of rounds for them and not much else. For a submachine gun, for example, you've only got 1 extra magazine. So what you really need to do is to avoid direct confrontations as much as possible, at least in close quarters, and stick to the long-range, cover-based shooting and such. And that way, you find that it's actually a fairly easy game. It's not all that hard to pick off your opponents once you get used to how the bullet mechanics work, and just getting used to judging what distances are going to be good for raising or lowering your elevation, because you do actually have to adjust your scope position to be able to shoot properly. And once you get used to how the AI behaves, you're probably not going to have any issues. Now, it does get more difficult once you get toward the end of the game, and whenever you're in a situation where it's very linear, which the game is linear, but some levels open up a bit more and let you have a bit more leeway in how you plan your attack. But then there are some levels that are a lot more linear and are actually a lot more difficult, because you're just thrown into these more cramped settings where you don't really have much choice in what your cover is, you don't have a lot of choice in how you engage your opponents, and thus you end up finding those rather annoying. But when the game opens up and lets you kind of sneak around and set things up and actually kind of be a sniper, that's when the game really shines. Because when you're going through these linear sections, it's just like, ugh, I want to get to the next bit so I just don't have to do this anymore. But when you're going through those open sections, you're like, okay, let's plan this out this way and be all diabolical to these guys. It's actually fairly interesting when that stuff happens, and it's a shame that it doesn't happen as much as it could, where the entire game could be that way. Unfortunately, they decided that linearity is a good thing, and so you do have a lot of segments where you're basically stuck in a corridor kind of deal, and you have to deal with a handful of enemies that are in really tight quarters or something like that. And in those situations, you're kind of screwed, because the only weapon you have that's actually suppressed is the well rod pistol, which is a one-shot and then you have to reload it weapon, as in you have to manually cycle the bolt. And so you're kind of limited in your options in close quarters, although it's still not that hard, because if you really do need to, you can whip out the submachine gun and just mow your enemies down with it. And it does get kind of weird when you go from level to level and you, for instance, pick up different sniper rifles. You start out with a Springfield, eventually you get access to a Mosin Nagant, and then you finally get access to a Gewehr 43. Well, you keep those when you pick them up until you get to the next tier anyway. And with the submachine guns and the pistols, you always revert to whatever you had at the very beginning of the game, which is the well rod and the Thompson submachine gun. Where you manage to find those, if you, say, picked up an MP40 or a PPSH or something like that, or you picked up like a Luger or something, I don't know, but somehow you magically have those back. And it's actually fairly annoying because the only way you can get well-wrought ammunition is to basically loot corpses, and you can't get ammo for the Thompson. So you have to go around and pick up an MP40 or a PPSH or something like that, and you have to rely on picking up ammunition from dead enemies. And you barely get any ammo from picking things up off corpses. For the well-wrought, that's fine because it's just such a limited amount of ammunition anyway, and it's a single-shot weapon. But for the submachine guns, picking up 2 or 3 rounds at a single time doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly when that enemy was packing, say, whatever submachine gun you're trying to pick up the ammo for. So they certainly do everything they can to make it abundantly clear that close quarters combat is not really what you want to be doing, and then they throw you into situations where it's like, okay, close quarters combat, go! And you better hope that you've got well-wrought ammunition and you actually manage to land that shot, because if you don't, well, you're kind of screwed. Granted, it's generally fairly easy to get yourself out of a bind like that, and you do have regenerating health, so the point's kind of moot. It's just a bit unfortunate that the stealth mechanics are just kind of bare bones. You just sneak around by either crawling on the ground or by crouching and walking, which somehow apparently makes you silent. But it's fairly easy for enemies to spot you unless you just manage to duck behind cover, and you do get that big indicator whenever you're being spotted. So you do have some time to make mistakes before you can duck behind cover and avoid being spotted. But even then, it's just a bare-bones stealth system, and while it does work, sometimes it's kind of iffy, sometimes the AI spots you too easily, sometimes you get spotted and you have no idea where you got spotted from. Sometimes the enemy is dumber than a sack of hammers and you just cannot get spotted for the life of you. And things get kind of silly when that happens. But it does work, and the single player does end up being actually fairly enjoyable, apart from a few parts here and there where it just tries to force you into situations that are kind of ridiculous. And it even makes going up against, say, tanks actually fairly amusing, because it has you sniping their fuel tanks and somehow that makes the tank explode. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's cool. So at least you've got one half of the game that's actually fairly varied despite being all about sniping, and is pretty enjoyable. But then there's the multiplayer. Now you would think that the multiplayer would be pretty cool because you do get co-op, and the co-op's alright. It's not the best I've ever played, but the game's fairly easy to begin with, so it's not like throwing some co-op into the mix would actually make it more enjoyable. But then there's the competitive multiplayer, where it's basically just a couple of modes, and they're not really all that great. You would think that the whole cat and mouse game of sniper versus sniper would be enjoyable, but it actually isn't in this case. And part of that really does stem from the fact that they just basically threw standard multiplayer modes into this thing and said, well, it's a game about snipers, so everybody's a sniper, and that's kinda it. They didn't really tailor the game to actually being sniper versus sniper, they just rolled with it. And what you have is pretty standard gameplay modes. You have free-for-all, team deathmatch, and capture the flag, and that's kinda it, really. And none of those modes are really enjoyable. What you're going to see here is capture the flag, and that was about the most enjoyable it got. There's barely any servers left in there anyway, so it's not like I had much choice. But even going one-on-one with someone you know in the free-for-all mode, so it's sort of like a sniper's duel thing, was really not that great. It was just really sluggish and slow-paced, and nothing really happened. So you would get a kill here and there, but then you would spend a good 10 minutes plus just not doing anything. It got really, really awkward. And if you're playing with a larger number of people, obviously you're just going to have a bit more of a mess, because now everybody's sniping everybody and you don't really have a lot of room to maneuver. But let's face it, when we think of sniper versus sniper, we think of something like Enemy at the Gates, where it's just all about this sort of sniper's duel. So it's just a shame that they didn't really implement that all that well in the game, and thus you have really, really lackluster multiplayer. It's not terrible, but it's just not very good either. So what you really go into this thing for is, of course, the single player, and though the X-ray does get gimmicky and just kind of tiresome after a while, you can turn it off if you want. it still manages to be a very different game in a sea of World War II games. Let's face it, there aren't all that many games about snipers. And this one actually pulls it off fairly well, despite being very arcadey in a lot of senses, and despite being kind of ridiculous at times. And there's plenty of room to improve the issues that this thing has in a sequel, which, of course, the game did get a sequel. I haven't played it yet, so we'll have to find out what happens with the sequel later on. But as for Sniper Elite V2, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.